If you're thinking of doing any gifts or year-end giving, please consider Act Out. We are a non-corporatized, independent news show, and we need your help to keep going. To become a patron of our show, visit patreon.com/actout. This week on Act Out, we gave you a lowdown last week on oil pipelines, but what about natural gas? Safer, right? Not so much. Here's the explosive reality of the natural gas pipelines crisscrossing our nation. Next up, mining companies have been given a green light to pollute on your dime, and the profession with the highest suicide rates in the country will probably surprise you. Finally, Mickey Huff from Project Censored joins us to talk about corporate media, truth in a post-truth era, and stories you didn't know that you didn't know. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. A Norwich flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. Kicking off our headlines and lowlives this week, let's transition from last week's pipeline talk with some natural gas news. If you recall, the map we featured last week shows crude oil and hazardous materials pipeline spills between 2015 and now. Based on federal data, in that 2.5-year period, the U.S. has averaged more than one burst pipeline a day. Also noted in the report was the fact that natural gas pipelines were not a part of that study, just crude oil and hazardous materials. But natural gas leaks are no big deal, right? It's natural and it's gas. That sounds pretty chill. No. Not only are natural gas lines no less prone to leaks, in many ways they are far more dangerous because of the potency and volatility of the fuels that are leaked. A prominent one being methane, which has at least 30 times the warming potential of carbon dioxide over the long term. Furthermore, leaked natural gas can't be recovered, and as we reported in episode 125, a leak can spread miles before the fuel is triggered by something as simple as a light switch, causing domino explosions all along the leak path. And in terms of frequency, consider this. Just last week in Lee County, Illinois, a father and son were killed when their tractor struck a natural gas pipeline, triggering an explosion. 2 more were injured in the blast that also resulted in flames shooting 150 feet into the air and heat waves reaching a quarter of a mile away. Kinder Morgan, the owner of the pipeline, said that the farmers, they should have just called a hotline before using a tractor on the field. Really? That's all you can say after you blow up 2 people? Elise Gerhardt is a Pennsylvania rural resident whose land is currently threatened by the Mariner East 2 pipeline, and whose story we have covered on this show before. Most recently in episode 125. When she heard this news, she had some straightforward questions and commentary regarding the Kinder Morgan comment and the incident. These pipeline companies say they will come and lay their pipe, and you'll never know that they were even there. They tell you you can go back to business as usual in your farm fields. Well, that's exactly what these people were doing. Regular, day-to-day farm work in a field where there was a gas pipeline. They tell you it's safe. They tell you there's nothing to worry about. What do they expect people to do when they say that? Tread lightly in the field with a tractor? There's blood on your hands, Kinder Morgan. In a similar incident last week, a pipeline in New Mexico exploded and caught fire. Luckily, no one was injured, but according to the company, Enterprise Products Partners, they have no clue what caused the explosion. A pipeline can explode without you even having the slightest clue as to why. What the hell is the matter with you? That's like forcing a community to play Russian roulette, but in the dark, underground, and also with a flamethrower. And then when somebody finally does blow up or get shot, you shrug your shoulders and say, well, these things happen. Not sure why, but it's not like we could avoid these situations. But of course we can. We can avoid all of these situations. In this map, similar to the crude oil leak map, every one of those leaks and explosions, every one of those plotted points is avoidable. According to federal data, between January 2010 and November 2017, the nation's natural gas transportation network leaked a total of 17.55 billion cubic feet of mostly methane gas. That's enough to heat 233,000 homes for an entire year, and it's got the same global warming potential as the carbon dioxide emitted from a large coal-fired power plant over the course of a year. Pipeline incidents took nearly 100 lives, injured close to 500 people, and forced the evacuation of thousands, while costing about $1.1 billion. And every last one of those 100 people would still be alive. Those 500 people wouldn't be suffering from injuries, those billions of cubic feet would not be polluting our air, and every last cent of that money could have been spent on anything else. And speaking of money, our next headline has to do with mining and a decision handed down by the EPA earlier this month that relieves mining companies of the responsibility of paying for their pollution. Citing an unnecessary burden to the mining industry, Penis Wrinkle Scott Pruitt made the announcement which essentially shifts more cleanup costs onto the shoulders of you and me, rather than the companies that pollute. Indeed, just between 2010 and 2014, the EPA spent $1.1 billion on cleanup work at abandoned hard rock mining and processing sites across the country. Under the Superfund Act of 1980, the EPA is supposed to force mining companies to prove that they have the financial ability to cover cleanup costs. But the follow-up never materialized. Under Obama, activists finally sued their way to a follow-through, which has now been reversed. Activists and their legal teams vowed to take this to court, but in the meantime, Americans have paid and will continue to pay both the environmental and economic costs of these perpetuating industry handouts. To give you an idea of how much, the EPA estimates the backlog of cleanup costs for hard rock mines across the country at $20 to $54 billion. And according to the Toxic Release Inventory, metal mining is the nation's leading source of toxic pollutants, generating nearly 2 billion pounds a year of hazardous materials such as arsenic, mercury, lead, and cadmium. As Rachel Kahn of Amigos Bravos put it, pollution from mining activities has contaminated drinking water, poisoned streams, killed fish, and caused corrosion of our nation's infrastructure. The Trump administration's final rule ensures that the public and the environment will continue to pay the price of this pollution. Moving on to our final headline this week, you might not think of this as the profession leading the country in suicides, because it's not veterans. In fact, these suicides outnumber veterans by more than double. It's farmers. Last year, a study by the CDC found that people working in agriculture, including farmers, farm laborers, ranchers, fishers, and lumber harvesters, take their lives at a rate higher than any other occupation. The data suggested that the suicide rate for agricultural workers in 17 states was nearly 5 times higher compared with that in the general population. But why? And why are we seeing this across the globe? As reported by The Guardian, an Australian farmer dies by suicide every 4 days. In the UK, 1 farmer a week. In France, 1 farmer dies by suicide every 2 days. In India, more than 270,000 farmers have died by suicide since 1995. Reasons, of course, vary in different areas of the world, but here in the U.S., Mike Rossman, an Iowa farmer and psychologist with more than 30 years' experience in counseling farmers, says that we can trace today's crisis back to the 80s. Considered the largest agricultural economic crisis since the Great Depression, farmers in the 80s suffered under the extreme weight of crashing markets, doubled interest rates, and thereby, of course, the loss of their livelihood, the land. More recently, since 2013, net farm income for U.S. farmers has declined 50%. Median farm income for 2017 is projected to be negative $1,325. And without parity in place, most commodity prices remain below the cost of production. With economic strains like these, plus social isolation and difficulties in physically, socially, and economically accessing mental health care, a more complete picture surrounding these horrific suicide rates begins to form. A farmer profiled in The Guardian expose, John Blask, was very candid about his feelings. In the last 25 to 30 years, there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about suicide, he said. And while Blask is clearly not alone in his sentiments when it comes to fellow farmers, he's very much alone with regards to federal concern. In 2008, a program modeled after Rossman's successful 7-state program that connected uninsured and underinsured farmers with affordable behavioral health services was finally federally approved, but not funded. As we see in other industries and indeed in general, the issue of paying to ensure mental health in the farming business was considered, quote, unnecessary expenditure, roughly $18 million a year. Rossman argues that the U.S. farmers lost by suicide totals much more in dollars, farmland, national security in the form of food, and the emotional and financial toll of families and entire communities. Indeed, as Dr. Nancy Zedek put it, the well-being of farmers is inextricably linked to the health of rural communities. Our Americana image of the stoic farmer in a cowboy hat never shows the realities of what living in rural America has become. We support the image without supporting the people that are the image. And as we stare down more income inequality, as covered in episode 137, as we stare down more economic downturn, these farmers represent yet another group of Americans suffering under the weight of our obese, oligarchical, capitalist, low-life scum regime.
You low-life scum.
Finally today, I want to shift from headlines to the concept of headlines. In our insidious empire, many people don't even know what they don't know. Censorship and cover-ups are ironically covered up by a giant shiny sign that reads, "Get your free press here." Talking heads spewing stories written by the Pentagon, the CIA, or other establishment interest groups fill the airwaves and yet somehow never fall under the banner of fake news or even propaganda. Luckily, the truth is out there. And in today's interview, we sit down with one of the most intrepid truth seekers out there, Mickey Huff. Mickey is the director of Project Censored, the invaluable endeavor that exposes and opposes news censorship, whilst promoting independent investigative journalism, media literacy, and critical thinking. Mickey sat down with us last week to talk about media in the post-truth anti-intellectual era, and outline some stories you didn't know that you didn't know. Take a look.
The core of this is that we don't really have a free press that goes to the root of these struggles, to the root of these problems. And when we do see corporate media cover these kinds of issues, it's very sensationalistic, it's very superficial, and it also does a lot of victim blaming. And we don't really get to see the consequences of the Pentagon 1033 programs and the paramilitarization of the police. We don't get to see the lack of transparency in police unions, for example. Police unions are extraordinarily powerful political organizations within the municipalities that they exist, and they're protecting their interests, and their interests are usually not necessarily in the public interests. And so a lot of the stories that we do over the years really kind of look at that issue, whether it's, Black Lives Matter, which is really a social justice movement, not only about racism, but about police state oppression. And we don't just cover the problems of those issues, even though, going back with Project Censored, we were founded in 1976. In 1977, our top story was on the myth of Black progress coming out of the civil rights movement. And last year in our 40th anniversary book, we covered the Black Lives Matter movement, saying, what has changed and what hasn't? We have a system in the United States. It's a for-profit private system of information dissemination, not that different than the prison system, for example. That's for-profit also in many cases. And we don't have a lot of intrepid journalists going and covering these stories because of the conflicts of interest. And because of long-standing historical inertia, right? Or the idea, the faux idea that, we had a civil rights movement, so we fixed those problems, and now we've had an African-American president, so we live in a post-racial society. Ask yourself how we have the rise of one of the most significant racially based social justice movements in Black Lives Matter during the Barack Obama presidency. And that should show you that we're not a post-racial society. We're a society that's in denial. We're a society that's awash in a sea of information with digital natives in a digital age of information where people have a paucity of understanding and lack critical thinking skills to dissect, deconstruct that information and propaganda. We have journalists that are afraid to ask tough questions because of who pays their paycheck, and advertisers and owners are basically ruling in that industry. And we don't have enough people paying attention to independent alternative truth tellers because there's no real profit in it. So at Project Censored, we try to give a platform for those kinds of stories that have been published. And like you mentioned, A lot of those stories are about police violence, police neglect, about prisons, a lack of social justice concerns. But we don't just focus on the problems. As you know, we also look at solutions. And one of our stories in the latest censored book, 2018, Press Freedoms in a Post-Truth World, um, was on 8 ways this was published by Yes Magazine and on Mike and other places. It's about what are ways that we could, as a community, work to have policing that is less invasive, that is less violent, that is less punitive. And this lists 8 things that you can do and you can push in your community to have less violent interactions with police.
Of course, what our media does is manufacture consent, and what we try to do is manufacture dissent. But I think people often don't realize how like intense and vast that propaganda machine is that manufactures consent via the media. And I know it could take, days to get into this, but there are behemoths behind, like hundreds of millions of dollars, PR firms behind
Yes.
our media that create news stories that are then regurgitated by so-called journalists. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And these stories, by the way, you can find at projectcensored.org. A lot of our chapters of our books aren't necessarily online, but some of the stories are. One of our top stories from this past year, in fact, was about how the Pentagon was paying PR firms to create fake Al Qaeda videos in the United Kingdom. Hill and Knowlton, the Rendon Group. Peter Phillips has a chapter in our Censored 2017 book, the 40th anniversary book, looking at the 3 major public relations firms, Omnicom, et cetera. Companies, by the way, that most people have never heard of, right? At least when we talk about corporate media, you can see people saying like, well, yeah, there's News Corp and Disney and I think Viacom's in there. People have at least some awareness, I think, of corporate media these days, maybe more so than not, given that we're now on the 30th anniversary of the propaganda model. This business with PR firms is incredibly insidious because they're paid from clients, and clients are client states, intelligence agencies, corporations, individuals, political candidates, companies that sell toothpaste. They all hire the same firms to sell their product, whether it's an ideology or a thing or a candidate or an election or a war, right? Hill and Knowlton, for example, was the company that was hired to coach the young daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador in 1990, going into 1991 with the first Gulf War, to coach her how to lie to Congress about how babies were allegedly being thrown out of incubators as Iraq invaded that country. Uh, did not happen. It goes back to the Bernays days of World War I, when the Committee on Public Information claimed that the Germans were throwing Belgian babies, ripping the arms off of Belgian babies. I mean, they don't even make new stuff up; they just recycle old stuff. But these lies are incredibly powerful because they appeal to people's emotions. And public relations firms, that's what they do. They're designed to sell a product or an idea, and they know how to do that fallaciously. They know how to do it by appealing to emotions. They know how to do it by attacking, dividing, conquering, distracting, distorting, obfuscating. The tactics are well known. I teach entire college courses on this. You said we could talk about it for hours, and yes, you're correct. Books have been written about it. But it's important to really just try to get that across to people because in this case, again, not telling people what to believe, but trying to give people a basic heads up that you are being manipulated. At least the efforts are afoot to manipulate you. The Rendon Group, John Rendon, is called the man who sold the war. A rare expose of him in the Rolling Stone a number of years, believe it or not, showed how he helped peddle weapons of mass destruction propaganda. And Rendon is a self-professed liberal, so it isn't just that these are right-wing people. This is a thing. It's a business thing. Public relations is a massive profiteering industry to manufacture consent. Capitalism is a driving force behind this because there are mass profits in war. War is a racket, as Smedley Butler said in 1935, is the second most decorated Marine in U.S. history, still is. And the way that we can continue that racket and the military-industrial complex boondoggles from the taxpayers is to divide, conquer, propagandize, and ritually lie to the public, especially in a permanently fear-based society that has been created after 9/11.
And furthermore, not just in terms of PR, but this idea of media collusion, like the New York Times running story by the Democrats in a recent expose that shows that LA Times colluded with the CIA in showing them drafts, but also asking the Times how they might asking the CIA how they might help spin stories like overseas drone strikes. So this isn't just like PR firms spinning this. It's actual papers and journalists, again, like going to government officials and saying, hey, is this okay with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned the Central Intelligence Agency. I mentioned the Pentagon earlier, but there are numerous intel agencies in the United States and around the world that actively engage in this practice. In the United States, we have the free press illusion that's protected by the First Amendment. And I don't mean to be flippant about that. There clearly are countries in the world that don't even have pretense to a free press. But the one dangerous thing about that, or I would say maybe insidious thing about that in the United States, is that because we have a predisposition that a free press actually exists, people don't necessarily ask the kind of questions that would demonstrate whether or not that's true. And in the case of the CIA, we've had deep state manipulation of media dating way back, whether it was the FBI created long before the Central Intelligence Agency or the CIA created in 1947 that got hot to trot on controlling media with Allen Dulles and the Dulles brothers. This has been documented in David Talbot's books, Devil's Chessboard. It's certainly been the topic in the censored books. But it's really difficult to get everyday Americans to the table to understand that this is a thing. It's not just a thing, it's a freaking industry. Mm-hmm. It's a multi-billion-dollar effort. It's a taxpayer boondoggle where we're paying to be misinformed. It goes all the way up through where the Pentagon is using taxpayer money to use the NFL as a political prop for militarization and jingoism. And yet we hear people saying we can't politicize the NFL with Colin Kaepernick taking the knee for social justice. Well, then stop propagandizing it for jingoism and CTE injuries and having people bash each other's skulls like cavemen. No offense to people that are troglodytes. But this is a real serious problem. It's the problem that we lack critical media literacy, we lack critical education, critical pedagogy that Henry Giroux talks about so much, that Paulo Freire talked so much about decades ago. So education coupled with media issues, this is where we're going to really help change that kind of landscape. There's no quick fix. Facebook thinks you're going to scale to the problem with fact checkers. That's impossible. Snopes has its own internal problems and can never scale to the difficulties of so-called fake news or propaganda, since fake news isn't new. We've had legislative efforts in our anti-intellectual culture to try to ban fake news. That's not going to go. That's part of the problem. What we really need is critical media literacy education, and we need crowd-contested media like my friends over at tribeworthy.com, right? Where it's like a Rotten Tomatoes or Yelp for news sources. So you can build trust in a community of news consumers, people that understand and read news, so that you don't have to rely on elite members of our society to tell us what news is and is not, where we have a government that decides this is foreign agent propaganda and this is actually news. Really? The Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, that got a $600 million contract with the CIA after he bought the Post, which, as you mentioned, if you go back and read the Brian Covert piece, the Washington Post, the New York Times, they were long working in collusion with the Central Intelligence Agency to peddle Cold War propaganda. This is historical fact. These are not fictions. These are not theories. These are realities. We just, however, live in a society that we're really not given the opportunity to discuss these in public platforms, a degree to which that when people like you or I or others, if we ever do get a platform in these places, we look like lunatics. Well, that's all part of the strategy of the conspiracy theorist label, is to suppress dissent. And you mentioned what one of the things that independent journalists ought to be doing is not manufacturing consent. It's creating dissent with facts and telling people what's really going on. Was what George Selby said in the 20th century is what the role of journalism actually is.
So I do want to ask, because something that Project Censored does is it has a very large focus on education in colleges and universities, and I'm reminded of the Powell memo, which talks not only about trying to get people with business interests inside media, but also inside of schools, because there were so many, when the Powell memo was written, there were so many uprisings at universities. So getting people that were pro-business, that were pro, the American enterprise model into the universities was a really powerful step. And so I'm wondering, not only what sort of roadblocks have you hit in that very pro-American enterprise university system, but also why so much importance on colleges and that particular portion?
Well, education, higher education, and particularly coming out of the early part of the 20th century with John Dewey and others, kind of really transformed the classroom into a laboratory to solve social problems and political problems and encourage civic engagement. But I'm glad you brought up the Powell memo, because that's something that a lot of people either have not heard of, don't remember. And this really is an important period of U.S. history coming out of the early 1970s. Lewis Powell, who's eventually on the Supreme Court, wrote this kind of manifesto or screed about how the 1960s were going the wrong way for elites, business people. This also comes on the heels of the Nixon administration's attack on the press. Let's remember that Donald Trump did not invent the fake news meme or the attacks on the media. This is an old story. In fact, it goes way back, and it's not just people in the United States doing it. The press as enemy of the people, that goes back to Nazi Germany and Germany in World War I. That's an old propaganda tactic. And in fact, Nixon's Vice President Spiro Agnew, in a speech penned by the great writer William Safire, the nattering nabobs of negativism alliteration, that talked about how members of the press were a 4-H club, that they were hopeless, hysterical hypochondriacs of history. That was in the 70s, right when the Powell memo, was being written. And that's when the American Enterprise Institute was founded, and these other right-wing think tanks. And their purpose was to infiltrate not only the public sphere and the op-ed pages and the news media, but also education, endowed professorships, money that would flow into colleges, public universities, and private to do certain things, have a very pro-business slant. And a true liberal education is about debate. It's about an exchange of ideas. It's not about control. It's not about railroading. And if you want to talk about conspiracies, what else is the Lewis Powell memo other than a conspiracy to shift to the right all of our public institutions? Here we are 40 some odd years later, and they've been resoundingly successful, in my estimation, at taking the Milton Friedman models, taking the models of the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Hoover Institute, and they have captured a decent amount of academia. And with the help of big pharma, big ag, big sugar, all these corporations, big oil and energy, they have really swayed public debate, not only through education, but through ownership and advertising and shareholding and the use of elite sources through corporate media.
Please note that this is just a portion of our full interview with Project Censored's Mickey Huff, so please check out our YouTube channel at the link below and in the description to see the full version. And to learn more about the fantastic and necessary work that Project Censored does, visit projectcensored.org. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. Check out the last slide to see the show description to see the sites that we mentioned in this week's show. And for interim updates, please visit us on social media. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for nothing, motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and served my shove. I'm not